Daisy Ridley is trying to return to the franchise that brought her fame, but she's dealing with more and more headaches from Disney, and now it's looking likely she's out. Before getting signed for Star Wars, Daisy Ridley actually never did a movie where the only film she was in was a brief role in the movie The Quiet Ones, where she was literally just a person in a photo. She did have a little bit of a better resume doing UK-based TV shows like Casualty and Toast of London, but they were always for single episode parts and not very significant to the episode. That actually ended up benefiting Daisy Ridley for Star Wars, where J.J. Abrams said the reason why he picked her was she was a complete unknown, which went against Disney's initial plan to cast a bigger name actress like Saoirse Ronan or Jennifer Lawrence. J.J. Abrams had the idea to hire unknown actors because Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford were all pretty unknown before Star Wars. Mark Hamill made his acting debut in the 1960s on The Bill Cosby Show and also had a recurring role on the show Texas Wheelers afterwards. Carrie Fisher had very little experience prior and only had fame because her mom was Debbie Reynolds, who was a much bigger name actress. Harrison Ford only got the role of Han Solo because he had a small part in George Lucas's previous movie American Graffiti, and he wasn't even the first 5 people they asked. Daisy Ridley ended up getting the part in that vein, and it did excite Disney because they only had to pay her $100,000 compared to Harrison Ford, who was making $25 million for Star Wars Episode 7. Making Star Wars Episode 7 was this weird thing because director J.J. Abrams actually had very little power over the direction of the trilogy. The biggest example being the character Snoke, where J.J. Abrams wasn't actually allowed to decide the character's origin, design, or even the gender, where Disney decided all of that in post-production. J.J. Abrams said Disney had no clear plans for the Star Wars sequel trilogy, where they wanted to have people react to Episode 7 and then decide how Episode 8 and 9 would go based on that reaction. Still, Episode 7 was a massive success, costing $447 million to make, but making $2.1 billion just in theaters alone. There's also massive amounts of money in merchandise, where the company Sphero, which was contracted to make the BB-8 toy, did $100 million in sales in 4 months. Even though Episode 7 was an undeniable success critically and commercially, there were a lot of Star Wars fans upset it was too similar to Star Wars A New Hope. So for Episode 8, Disney replaced J.J. Abrams with Rian Johnson and gave him the order to make it as different as possible. Radical might not always be better, where many fans were upset how they portrayed Luke Skywalker as more depressed and also gave him a very anticlimactic death, which Mark Hamill warned Disney and Rian Johnson about it, saying that fans were gonna hate it, but he still went along with it anyway. Even though the critics liked it, fans hated it, getting only a 41% on Rotten Tomatoes. That definitely reflected the box office, where Star Wars Episode 8 made $800 million less than the first movie made, even though it did cost $147 million less. Star Wars was still profitable until Disney's CEO Bob Iger intervened, trying to make Star Wars more like Marvel. Marvel at this point was Disney's cash behemoth, where they bought the company in 2009 for $4 billion, and cut to 7 years later they were doing 2 movies a year just printing money. Bob Iger's idea was he wanted to do a different Star Wars movie every year, and it looked like it was going to work with Rogue One, which made $1.1 billion on a budget of $280 million. What Disney didn't realize is the world of Marvel is more diverse, and they can release a movie like Thor or Ant-Man or Captain America and have very different feels all in the same year. But still, Star Wars has a very similar world which people could get tired of if they do too much at the same time, which was why Solo was a massive failure, making just $393 million on a budget of $330 million, losing $150 million for Disney. Making Solo was a nightmare because Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were fired from the movie because they didn't get along with Kathleen Kennedy or Disney. They brought in Ron Howard to be the new director, who was a longtime friend of George Lucas, having done the movie American Graffiti with him, but at the same time he had to reshoot 80% of the movie, and because that cost went up $100 million. And because of the failure of Solo, Disney decided to cancel all their planned Star Wars spin-off movies, including a very big sequel that involved Darth Maul. At the same time, Star Wars Episode 9 failed, where it only made $1.1 billion on a budget of $417 million, which means it wasn't actually profitable. J.J. Abrams, who's brought back to direct Episode 9, called it the worst experience of his life and publicly feuded with Disney afterwards. One example being J.J. Abrams wanting Adam Driver's story in Episode 9 to make him more evil and not a repeat of Darth Vader's story, but Disney made him do a redemption. And both Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver called the romance extremely forced, saying it was the worst kiss scene they ever had to film. J.J. Abrams also had an entire storyline to explain why Palpatine was resurrected, but Disney cut it to make the movie shorter. J.J. Abrams said he also wanted to give John Boyega, who played Finn, more screen time in the movie, but Disney opted not to do it because they were worried about international audiences, aka they don't like black people. Since Solo and Episode 9 failed, Disney's actually had 10 Star Wars movies they planned to make canceled. David Bennett and D.B. Weiss, who were the showrunners for Game of Thrones, were supposed to do a Star Wars trilogy, but after Game of Thrones failed in the final season, they ended up not doing that. Wonder Woman director Patty Jenkins was supposed to direct a Star Wars movie, but Disney doesn't like her that much because they fired her from Thor 2 years ago. Taika Waititi, who directed Thor Ragnarok, was supposed to direct a Star Wars movie, but ended up not happening after Thor Love and Thunder got bad reviews. The only Star Wars movie announced in the last 5 years that has finished production and actually will come out is the Mandalorian spin-off movie, and that was just because they already had the sets made from the show. Speaking of Mandalorian and Disney oversaturating things, they actually have done almost 10 different shows on Disney Plus that were Star Wars related, and nobody's watching them anymore, with The Acolyte having a $230 million budget and failing after 1 season. Now Disney said they want to go back to the Star Wars sequel trilogy and actually do a movie set 10 years after Episode 9, bringing back Daisy Ridley. Daisy Ridley's career hasn't been in the best place, where after Episode 9 she said she wasn't offered any work for 2 years. Her biggest movie outside of Star Wars is Chaos Walking, which failed, making only $27 million on a budget of $125 million. Disney angered a lot of fans when they announced Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy would be the new director for the Rey movie they were doing. The reason is Charmin has almost no experience actually directing movies, where she labels herself as a feminist activist and is mainly known for doing documentaries. Charmin also said she doesn't care about the tears of the men who were complaining. But now the movie's struggling, where it was just announced they lost their screenwriter, and even though it was originally supposed to come out in 2025, they pushed it to 2026 or 2027, so it's not likely to ever come out. It's very likely this is going into Disney's graveyard of failed projects, and Daisy Ridley is out of Star Wars. And with that, I'm Charles Pearl. Please subscribe if you learned something.